for a long time. The good news, virtually all of Iraq's imports and exports had been cut off. You read the reports. Do the reports tell you the sanctions are working?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. They are having a tremendous effect on the Iraqi economy. We're worried now about our own country going into recession. We're talking about a diminishing gross national product, somewhere 3 to 6%. And that's a serious economic matter. If we get up to a 20% reduction in our gross national product, people would be talking the word depression. The Iraqis, since August, have already had about a 50 to 60% reduction in that gross national product. About half of all the goods and services are gone.
The sanctions were actually working much better than the White House ever imagined they would work, in the sense that very little was getting into Kuwait. They had managed to seal the borders fairly effectively. But Saddam Hussein was not responding as they expected he would respond to the sanctions, nor were the Iraqi people. So though they were effective, they'd begun to realize that sanctions alone would not convince Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait.
President Bush continues to take a political beating. Mr. Bush's approval rating has dropped 19 points in the last month.
By the middle of October, the ABC Washington Post poll showed that support for the president's policy in the Gulf was dipping to a new low, though still a majority. The next day, opponents of his Gulf policy confronted the president at a campaign rally in Iowa. And that weekend saw the first organized nationwide anti-war marches of the Gulf crisis. Do you think Saddam Hussein looks at us and says, paper tiger?
I think Saddam Hussein looks at the United States and its recent military record, Vietnam, Beirut, and says this is a country that is not prepared to take the course, that public pressure, anti-war fervor will grow and will eventually force the U.S. to back down.
I think the administration was beginning to feel at that point they were getting messages back from third parties that Saddam Hussein just did not treat this seriously. He was willing to wait the economic sanctions out. He believed he could split the coalition. He believed the American public would never support any military conflict.
And George Bush's problem, and I think they recognized that, was that in a game of chicken with Saddam Hussein, Bush had no credibility. That here you had a guy, you know, prep school, Andover, Yale, Skull and Bones, you know, UN, trying to convince Al Capone that he was tougher than he was. And it wasn't working. Certainly wasn't working through sanctions.
One of the things we don't know is what was going on in George Bush's head in the middle of October. But what we do know is that beginning in October, there was serious thought given to what would you do if the president orders us to go on the offensive.
On October 23rd, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, met in Saudi Arabia with the head of American forces, General Schwarzkopf.
One of the things that they talked about specifically is what would you need, Norm, for a decisive force. Decisive force, it's an important phrase. If you were ordered to expel forcibly Iraq from Kuwait. At the same time, the president apparently came to a decision around the 24th of October that he wanted to provide the offensive capability.
Over the weekend, Powell and the Joint Chiefs put together their plan for an offensive force, a plan that would more than double the U.S. troops to 430,000. On Tuesday, October 30th, President Bush met with the congressional leadership. He did not mention he was planning a dramatic buildup of forces. The same day, Powell and Defense Secretary Cheney briefed the president on the Pentagon plan.
The president apparently took it all in, and on the 31st, Halloween, Wednesday, decided at that time that, yes, indeed, he was going to add Phase 2, and that the decision would be held secret till after the election, which it was. It stayed secret for 8 days.
At the same time, President Bush sent Secretary of State Baker on a round of talks with U.S. supporters to lobby for a new Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force to drive Hussein from Kuwait. On November 8th, Baker met with Shevardnadze and Mikhail Gorbachev at the Soviet president's dacha outside Moscow.
These three men all essentially talked themselves into the idea that at this time, unless Saddam Hussein is faced with two choices and two choices only, stay in Kuwait and die, leave and live, he's really not going to be moved. But one of the points that Gorbachev made to Baker was that if we're going to go for this resolution, you've got to understand, President Bush has to understand, that if you authorize the use of force by the UN, then you got to be ready to use that force if Saddam doesn't actually leave by January 15th or by whatever the deadline is. And he looked Baker in the eye and said, are you really ready to use that force if this guy calls your bluff?
And Baker said?
He said, yes.
Yes, we're ready to use it.
We understand, he said.
Later that same day, the president announced his decision to more than double the U.S. forces. Operation Desert Shield became Operation Desert Sword.
I have today directed the Secretary of Defense to increase the size of U.S. forces committed to Desert Shield to ensure that the coalition has an adequate offensive military option should that be necessary to achieve our common goals.
Changing Operation Desert Shield to Desert Sword was a momentous decision, but it did not represent a fundamental change in U.S. objectives. From the beginning, the president had said Saddam Hussein must leave Kuwait, but he had now changed his mind about what it would take to force him out. Despite his enormous success in convincing the world to stand against Iraq, President Bush believed he had failed to convince the one man who counted, Saddam Hussein. In secret, the president had decided that only the threat of all-out war would convince Hussein to withdraw, and he was now gambling that by sending more troops, by making his threat credible, he would never have to deliver on it.
I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs.
If there is one single event which haunts President Bush and the men around him, it is Vietnam.
The whole desire to do this quickly, all out, to not be slowly sucked into something incrementally, that is the central lesson of Vietnam. And they say that they've learned it. They all refer to Vietnam.
Much more.
Bush very specifically said to the chiefs, don't give me another Vietnam.
Supporting them strongly.
He has said publicly, this will not be another Vietnam. Powell came of the generation of young officers who were in Vietnam. And to a man, I would say, they share the belief that the conventional wisdom, as it were, that the gradualism of Vietnam was a bad thing, that it cost us many lives. To avoid the quagmire, the best thing to do is to hit him with everything you got right away. That's clearly the strategy, this doctrine of overwhelming force that has been driving phase 2 of the deployment.
They also are concerned because the American public remembers Vietnam. It is the war in many Americans' minds, and so the White House feels it has to differentiate the situation. It has to convince the people in order to win support that this will not be another Vietnam.
10, 15, 20,000 kids coming back to this country in body bags.
And I think the president has a real obligation here to explain why liberating Kuwait is in our vital interest. That is...
On Capitol Hill, where support for the president's policy had been strong through the first 3 months of the Gulf crisis, the surprise announcement that he was doubling the U.S. troops drew immediate reaction.
If George Bush wants his presidency to die in the Arabian desert, he can get his wish.
The president effectively is thumbing his nose at Congress. He's really gearing up. I think that in many ways, Bush was contemptuous of Congress and didn't take them seriously enough, that he was politically inattentive to Congress. And the greatest proof of that is that he didn't tell Sam Nunn, who was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and the most powerful voice on these matters in Congress, that he was doubling our troop strength until 30 minutes before he announced it to the public. That was a mistake.
I did not know it until about an hour before, and of course, the first thing I said was, what does this do to our capability of letting the embargo have time to work? So that had a signal, a very strong signal to me that the Bush strategy #1, that is the embargo being the main vehicle to get Iraq out of Kuwait, with the military forces being there to deter, defend, and enforce the embargo. That mission had fundamentally changed. The sanction policy was not going to be given time to work.
When Sam Nunn raises questions about military preparedness, or Sam Nunn says that he thinks that sanctions should work...
Cokie Roberts reports on Congress for ABC and National Public Radio.
Members of Congress respond differently than if someone who is traditionally perceived as a liberal anti-militarist raised the same questions. So by him raising these questions, it's raised them in a lot of people's minds.
On November 14th, with talk in the air about a special session to debate the crisis, the president decided to meet congressional criticism head-on by inviting the leadership to the White House.
There are some people at the table. Dick Gephardt suggests that we ought to let the economic sanctions go for 2 years. There's a lot of chuckling at the table as they realize that would be November 1992. So the president pulls out of his pocket a copy of the Constitution, and there is some debate back and forth about the powers of the presidency and the powers of the legislative branch. And Bush basically listens to it and then says, I've consulted you up until now. I will continue to consult you. Then Senator Boren says, well, I don't think there's any need for a special session. We've expressed our views. The others go, here, here. There's some clapping around the table, and they fold up and go home.
Clear the shot. Why now clear the shot?
In the Congress, what you mainly have is people who want it both ways. People who want to be able to say, we are for the president, we support his policy, we're against aggression, we're tough. But on the other hand, if everything goes bad, to be able to say, we told him so, we warned him, we have no fingerprints.
Are you satisfied, Mr. Speaker?
As a result of that meeting, I think Baker, Bush, and Scowcroft basically decided that they had to have a UN resolution authorizing force as much for their international coalition as for their domestic one. Their argument was, geez, if we can get the Ethiopians and the Finns to sign on to this, surely we can get Tom Foley and Bob Michael to sign on to it. So that was when the decision was really made to go for it.
By late November, the administration was making its final moves at the UN, lining up votes for a Security Council resolution authorizing the use of military force against Iraq.
War is not neat, it's not tidy, and once you resort to it, it's uncertain, and it's a mess.
At the same time, Senator Nunn opened new hearings on the Gulf, featuring a parade of witnesses critical of the president's decision to push the standoff with Iraq to a swift conclusion. There were some surprises, like Colin Powell's predecessor, Admiral William Crowell.
It would be a sad commentary if Saddam Hussein, a two-bit tyrant who sits on 17 million people and possesses a gross national product of $40 billion, proved to be more patient than the United States.
But on November 29th, with Secretary of State Baker personally doing the last-minute lobbying, the United Nations Security Council authorized the use of force if Iraq did not leave Kuwait by January 15th.
Simply put, my friends, it is a choice between right and wrong. Between right and wrong.
The administration had what it wanted. There had been a line in the sand, and now there was a firm ultimatum, a deadline in the sand as well. It had been nearly 30 years since a president had so deliberately taken the nation to the brink of war. In October of 1962, following the discovery of long-range Soviet missiles in Cuba, President John F. Kennedy called together a select group of his advisors who would meet in secret to decide how to answer the threat. Theodore Sorensen was one of them.
There was diversity of opinion, there was diversity of background, there was debate within our group, and as a result of that debate and long discussion, opinions changed, and slowly a position was hammered out, which the President stated in a television address to the nation, quite different from what his position might initially have been.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
A naval blockade was established, and the U.S. delivered an implied ultimatum to the Soviets, threatening force if the missiles remained. Then as now, the President had to convince one man.
Even at the hottest moments of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were engaged in a correspondence, sometimes public and sometimes private, with Khrushchev. And that turned out to be key to the peaceful resolution of the crisis in the end.
Formal letters were exchanged between the two leaders, and diplomatic back channels were used as well. In a critical private conversation, the President's brother met with the Soviet ambassador and told him that if Khrushchev would back down, then later the U.S. would withdraw its obsolete missiles from Turkey. In the end, Khrushchev did remove the missiles from Cuba, and today Sorensen says the key to that success was a kind of group the President had assembled to advise him.
I would say it's important for the President to seek a diversity of advice and not simply to have cheerleaders who are unanimous in their views.
Suppose the circle had been a lot smaller. Do you think the outcome would have been different?
You know, Kennedy had two crises in Cuba. The first was called the Bay of Pigs, and that was a plan which was held very tightly within a very small group. It was not subjected to any serious debate or diversity of opinion, and Kennedy got a black eye, and the country got a black eye because it turned out to be a fiasco. And he was determined the second time around to have a different procedure, to consult outsiders as well as insiders, career experts as well as political appointees, people of different views and judgments, and the result was much better.
On November 30th, the day after the UN resolution authorizing force, President Bush invited the Iraqi foreign minister to Washington and offered to send Secretary Baker to Baghdad.
I will suggest to Iraq's president that he receive the Secretary of State at a mutually convenient time between December 15th and January 15th of next year.
The prime motivation of sending Baker on this mission was for domestic political reasons. The President wanted to be able to stand up and say, I've gone the extra mile to avert a war. But I don't think anyone really seriously believes that somehow this meeting is going to do it.
The Iraqis immediately accepted Bush's offer, subject to an agreement on the dates, and a few days later, Hussein announced he was releasing all foreign hostages immediately.
On the day the hostages were released, there was a real sense among some of his top staff that that was a signal that Saddam knew that George Bush was serious, and within 24, 36 hours, they began to think, well, letting the hostages go was a pretty smart public relations move on Saddam Hussein's part, and backed off some of that joy.
Despite the hopes raised by the hostage release, Iraq and the U.S. were at odds over a date for Baker's visit. Hussein insisted on January 12th. The White House said that was too close to the deadline.
And it simply is not credible that he cannot, over a 2-week period, make a couple of hours available for the Secretary of State on an issue of this importance. Unless, of course, he is seeking to circumvent the United Nations deadline.
Mid to late December, when Saddam refused to meet with Jim Baker, refused to agree to a date over that 15-day period the White House offered, it suddenly dawned on George Bush and his top advisors that Saddam had not really done anything they expected during this entire crisis. There was no signal that Saddam Hussein was going to get out of Kuwait. they have suddenly become very discouraged.
By Christmas, President Bush had achieved enormous success in convincing most of the world that resolving the Gulf crisis would define a new world order. But now in the endgame, what mattered most was his ability to convince Saddam Hussein, and that would depend in part on how well he understood his adversary.
George Bush trusts very few people. He's comfortable with people he knows, he relies upon. I do think he's been listening to other heads of state, but I don't think he has reached out very much to the expert community.
One expert the president did speak with is Fuad Ajami, professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Ajami believes the president gets most of his sense of Saddam Hussein from talking with Arab leaders, like Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak.
Mubarak had gone to Baghdad at the height of the Iran-Iraq war, when the war was going badly for Saddam. And instead of seeing the self-confident Saddam, blustering Saddam, bravado Saddam, he saw a broken man. There is also a kind of a portrait of Saddam being offered to the Americans by the Egyptians that says, look, we know this man. We did business with him. We saw him on the verge of psychological breakdown during the Iran-Iraq war. He's not really the courageous man he says he is. He's a frightened man.
In late December, in a Time magazine interview, the president said about Hussein, "My gut says he will get out of there."
Since the new year, for the first time, that very top people in the administration have begun musing about how they may have miscalculated, how they may have misread Saddam, that they may have applied Western values and a Western measurement to Saddam Hussein, who really, by all indications, does not think like the President of the United States. Something happened to the President personally, I think, during December and particularly the Christmas holidays. I think he had some quiet time, 12 days at Camp David. George Bush is not known for going any place and sitting still for 12 days. His staff was stunned that he could possibly go to the mountains and spend that much time. I think he came to grips himself with the fact that nothing had worked so far, that Saddam Hussein had not responded in any way, and on January 1st he came back and told his staff he had worked through this issue. In his mind, it was black and white, it was good and evil. He didn't want to go to war, but if he had to go to war, he was prepared to do it.
As a new Congress convened, President Bush made a final offer for a meeting between Secretary Baker and Iraqi Foreign Minister Aziz. The president said he was willing to make one last attempt to go the extra mile for peace. In Geneva, the meetings lasted more than 6 hours, exceeding expectations and raising the hopes of many who did not know what was happening in the room.
After the third session, which is the final session, the Secretary of State then calls the President again and basically gives him a very grim readout, tells him that Tariq Aziz wouldn't even accept the letter.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, I heard nothing today that, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever on complying with the United Nations Security Council resolutions.
Would Iraq agree to leave Kuwait and promised an international conference on the question of Palestine?
I did not put it that way.
Here we are listening to a 45-minute press conference after the Secretary of State of the United States had a 6 hours worth of meetings over there, and there was not one single sentence that has to relate to their willingness to get out of Kuwait. And so,
I thought in his press conference he seemed edgy, nervous, impatient. He's clearly made his peace with going to war, and I don't think he wants to dither around much longer. I think he's ready to go, and he's fearful of a long, protracted, hand-wringing process both at home and abroad.
The day after the breakdown of talks in Geneva, the United States Congress began its long-avoided debate on whether or not to authorize the president to use military force against Iraq after January 15th.
But this is the truth. I could not accept the loss of life of any of our children in the Persian Gulf right now, and that tells me that in my gut, I do not believe that it's time to go to war.
I implore this body to demonstrate to the world, and especially Saddam Hussein, that we are behind our president and the United States nations.
Why is it now is Congress putting its fingerprints on this?
Because they were embarrassed not to. I think that there was a lot of pressure not to have a vote, not only from members of the Congress, but from the White House. But finally, the voice is raised saying, if you want to have a congressional prerogative that says we have the power to declare war, and you keep silent with a deadline in front of you, don't ever bring it up again.
I see no compelling reason to rush to military action. Of course, there are no guarantees on economic sanctions. There are also no guarantees on war. Where are the guarantees on war?
It is unthinkable that our government would now lose its will. Having urged the world to approve combined action, it is not an option for the Congress of the United States to disapprove what we for months have asked others to support.
And the truly haunting question, which no one will ever be able to answer, will be, did they die unnecessarily? For if we go to war now, no one will ever know if sanctions would have worked if given a full and fair chance.
After 3 days of debate, the House and the Senate both adopted a resolution giving the president the authority to make war on Iraq.
What the Congress did today was indeed historic, and I will conclude here by once again thanking them for coming to grips with the question, obviously thanking them for backing the position that is so strongly held by so many countries around the world. Thank you all very much.
And so, at the end of the game, the leader of the last superpower seemed to be holding all the cards. He had convinced the world, a majority of the American people, and finally the Congress of the rightness of his course. From what we know tonight, it has been a course charted almost entirely by the instincts of George Bush, who drew his own lessons from World War II about the price of appeasement and from Vietnam about the cost of gradualism. In a decision taken in secret and ratified by a close-knit group of like-minded advisors, the president had calculated that by deploying overwhelming military power, he could force Saddam Hussein to back down without firing a shot. And now, in the last hours before the deadline, the difference between war and peace is riding on whether the President of the United States was right or wrong. For Frontline, I'm Harding Carter.
Tomorrow night at 7, Nova looks at the confusion over cold fusion. Now stay tuned for the Civil War to examine political infighting that threatened to swamp Lincoln's administration and chronicles the bloodiest day of the war. The series continues through Friday night.